Hi, I'm Melanie Benjamin. I'm the author of The Girls in the Picture, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Author's Voice, where we are connecting authors to the world. This is Solved, where we talk about crime fiction and true crime, and I'm your host, Libby Hellman. Today, we're going to be talking to Melanie Benjamin, who is the author of The Girls in the Picture from Delacorte Press. It's $28, and we want to thank Delacorte for making Melanie available to us, which brings us to the woman herself. Hi, Melanie.
Hi, good to see you.
It's great to see you, too. Technically, this is not a crime story we're going to be talking about, but there were 3 reasons that I really wanted to have Melanie on the show. The first one is that you did start out writing chick lit with an element of mystery in it, and before you turned to history, which was the second reason I wanted to have you on, is because I love historical fiction. I write it myself, and we share a love of history. And the third reason is that we're going to be talking about the movies, the early years of the movies, and what could be more fun than that?
I agree.
That is what your story is about. So tell me, why this book? How did it come to you?
You know, I am a rabid Hollywood fan. Okay, I wanted to be an actress when I grew up. And Turner Classic Movies, my favorite movie channel in the world. So I have long been fascinated and read everything about Hollywood, all its eras. But I have to say, the early years of Hollywood, when they were inventing it, when they were making it up as they went along, and nobody knew if it was going to last, there was such a raw energy to that time period that has always attracted me. And just when everything was new, every time you positioned a camera a new way, you invented a language we are still using today. And as I've read so much about that era, the women of those early years, particularly Mary Pickford, who we all know, I think we know her name, but Frances Marion, who we may not, but we should, and their female compatriots were just as responsible for inventing Hollywood as the better-known men. The names we remember today. In the beginning. Yeah. But though they're not remembered for that. And the friendship between Mary and Frances has always attracted to me. It seemed very cinematic in a way, very epic. It encompasses love, life, death, war, tragedy, success. Everything you could put in a novel, their friendship had. So that's why I wanted to write it.
You knew about her, Frances Marion, and her friendship before you committed to the book.
Right. This is actually a novel I pitched to my editor many times over the years, and she always said no. And she did. There's something about, in her head, she saw it as purely a Hollywood novel, and she doesn't like Hollywood novels, but I kept it. I persisted, and then nevertheless she persisted. And then she realized, it's a girl power novel. I said, it is a very girl power. It's a very feminist, friendship, supportive girl power novel. And that's when she said, oh, okay.
Yeah. No, in this day and age, you couldn't have timed it better even if you wanted to.
I couldn't have. I mean, I finished it a year and a half ago, so it's not like I anticipated the Me Too movement. But or Time's Up, but it's certainly, this book shows women working in a male-dominated industry, but at a time when at least, if your movies were successful, there was a place for a couple of you at the table. 100 years ago this happened.
And now, it's hard to believe.
And now 100 years ago, we're still trying to get back to that place at the table.
Before we get into more details, I do want to tell everyone that you are welcome to write in questions. Just write them in on the comments section of Facebook Live. And if you're watching on Authors Net, there's a little screen below the screen that you're watching on, and you can write in a question. Just give us your first name and where you're from, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And more importantly, as we're talking, we really hope that you'll want to order Melanie's book. It is available on authorsvoice.net. You can get to it with just one click from Facebook Live, and the folks that are watching on AuthorsNet, you already know where it is. So please order the book. You won't regret it. Okay. So yeah, my first question after that was going to be the irony of when it came out.
Right. Yeah. No, I didn't predict it. But to me, the stunning fact remains that why it's so relevant today is we're talking about 100 years ago when Mary Pickford and Frances Marion together collaborated on the most popular movies coming out of Hollywood. They were really, and Frances wrote them, and Frances was the one who developed the little girl character that Mary became so famous for. They were at the top of the heap 100 years ago, and not just them, but their female compatriots, other directors and writers. And then what happened? Where did all the women go?
I want to ask you that. I kind of got where I think you were going on that. But at the time when they were writing, there wasn't really the Hollywood that we know today, number one, and there was still some discrimination. I mean, those flickers.
Yeah.
The people who were elite said,
well, right. I mean, actors at first didn't have names. Movie stars did not have names. Mary Pickford was first known as just Little Goldilocks because they didn't reveal their names. In part, that was so the studios didn't have to pay the actors very much. But it was also because the actors themselves, if they were legitimate, if they had Broadway aspirations, they didn't want people to know that they were in these flickers. It was definitely slumming it.
Did Mary feel that way?
I think she did at first. She very reluctantly went in 1909 and knocked at the door of the Biograph studio in New York, and a man named D.W. Griffith gave her first job in the movies. She did it because the Broadway play she had been in closed. And she had a mother and a younger brother and a sister. She was responsible for them. She was the breadwinner. She always had been from a very early age when their father died. And so she was the actress who was the breadwinner. Her Broadway show closed. Okay, I guess I have to go to the flickers now and make some money. It was very much, but she quickly fell in love with the idea and understood that here was a chance to invent a new art form. She had the greatest respect for them after she started. She completely understood. She saw what Griffith was doing. She understood we are creating something brand new and the possibilities are endless. And she became probably the biggest movie fan of her era. I mean, when she wasn't making movies, she was watching them.
Right, and you say that she always talked business, that she was driven.
She was obsessed with her career and with movies.
Yeah.
And she, to the point where, unfortunately, I think it became, she didn't have much of a life outside of her family.
Gee, we can relate.
I know. But I mean, I think you compare her to Frances Marion, who we'll get to in a bit, the writer. Frances had much wider interests. Frances was able to have a better home life and a family life because, unlike Mary, she didn't live, breathe, drink every second of the day, movies, 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 my career, business, business, business.
I remember there was when she and Doug Fairbanks were together, she would have the grosses for the box offices sent to wherever they were.
Wherever they were. She and Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin, along with D.W. Griffith, started United Artists.
Right.
We forget Mary Pickford was the first female head of a major motion picture studio. And that didn't happen again until the 80s, when Sherry Lansing was head of Paramount. But Charlie Chaplin, who was not much of a businessman, once said Mary Pickford would have run General Motors had she not been an actress. She was that good. She knew every period and every clause of every contract, and she did. She was always urging Fairbanks to buy billboards ahead of time for his movies, and she did have the grosses sent to them whenever they traveled the world. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay, so you write about how Mary and Frances first met. I mean, Frances was kind of, Mary's husband kind of made the introduction, and it was on set. Why do you think what was it about Frances that Mary decided she would give her a chance?
That's such a good question about Mary. Mary Pickford was not known for having a lot of close friends. Again, from the age of 7, she was on the road touring in really bad theatrical productions to put bread on her family's table. She was the father figure of her little family. Didn't leave a lot of time for friends. She didn't have a normal childhood. She wasn't educated. She didn't go to school. So she didn't have that normal kind of family life, and I think later on in her older years, it led her to feel very intimidated by people. Her lack of education embarrassed her, so she kind of holed up in her mansion and made her movies, and that's about it. Whereas Frances Marion, who was 4 years older, well educated, from a San Francisco family, didn't grow up hard scrabble like Mary. But Frances fell in love with the movies. She fell in love with the idea of the flickers and wanted to be a writer, not an actress. I do think that's one reason why Mary invited her in, because she wasn't competition. I do think that. But there is something.
But even back then, you talk about how they all did everything.
Well, right,
I mean,
they
Frances
did.
was cast.
She,
in a
against
few
her
movies.
will, she did do
Yeah.
a few movies. She didn't want to. But yeah, in those days, it was not unusual for Mary Pickford even to be editing her own film, or sweeping up the sawdust from the corner of a set, directing somebody else's film if they didn't show up to work that day. And it really was very egalitarian. But Frances and Mary, I think Mary just needed a friend at that moment. And she recognized something in Frances. She recognized, here's someone who loves the movies as much as I do, who wants to learn about them. I can help her. But who also is an ambitious woman who wants a career, as Mary did. And in those days, and we're talking 1914 when they met, that was not usual for women. I do think their shared ambition really bonded them. Their desire to put their career ahead of men.
Really, at the time, I remember you have a great scene where the two of them are bonding. I think it's when they're in the bungalows together.
They lived literally side by side
for a while.
For a long time.
And this is still the early years we're talking about, where they say we're never going to let a man come between us.
Right, and they never really did. You know, they really.
But they did. You know,
inevitably they did.
Okay, so
as time went on, they did.
They seemed to both meet the men that they would marry, like within months of each other.
And through each other. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mary met Douglas Fairbanks at a party. Frances was present. Mary was already married. And then Mary introduced Frances to the love of her life. Yeah. He was in the Army, World War I, and Mary was the honorary captain of the regiment, and saw this very quite handsome young lieutenant and thought, oh, he'd be really nice for my friend Frances, and introduced them, and that was the love of Frances's life.
And he was a minister, too.
He was an Episcopalian minister who fell in love with a twice-divorced woman working in the films. He had to leave the cloth for that. But by the time Frances was done, she turned him into one of the leading cowboy stars of the day. I think that's just hysterical.
I love that
whole arc of the relationship.
We're happy to take questions for Melanie, so don't be shy. Write them in on the Facebook comment section or on the author's voice. And meanwhile, okay, I know you probably get asked this in every interview. Let's talk about the research.
Okay.
How much research did you do before you started writing, or do you research and write it as you go?
The interesting, and I say interesting, it's only interesting to me, thing about my writing is that I tend to write about subjects I already have a pretty strong interest and background in. As I said, I've read a lot about the silent era. I'm fascinated with them. I knew these women before I thought this would make a good novel. So I don't have to do as much research as you think. I'm already I usually write about people I have already been interested in and learned a lot about.
Okay.
So by the time I start to write the novel, yes, there is still research to do, but it's not quite as intensive as I think a lot of people think. I also write in the past, so even going to visit locations, I mean, Hollywood doesn't look a thing like it did in 1914.
Your descriptions were so meticulous, though.
Well, you read I looked at a lot of photographs, I looked at a lot of old movies, newsreels, read a lot of books. Hollywood is not good at preserving its past. I did go to Hollywood. I went to the Douglas Fairbanks Center for Research, the Margaret Herrick Library there, and saw some of the scripts that Frances wrote, a lot of Mary's papers, a lot of clippings. That was very helpful. But as far as going to visit places in Hollywood that would figure in my book, they no longer exist. Paved over for a parking lot or another studio. Right. Pickfair's gone. Frances's home is gone.
Pickfair is gone?
Oh, yeah, yeah. In the 80s or 90s? Yeah. Most of those old, early Hollywood, the first mansions of the stars up in Beverly Hills, most of those are gone, replaced by something newer and better. And that is kind of Hollywood in a nutshell. Old is replaced by new. So it's
kind
hard.
of our whole culture.
Yeah, but I think it's a shame that Hollywood, especially I would say in the first 40 years of its existence, just didn't think to save a lot of its history. Yeah.
And you have, okay, so the research you had pretty much done. There's a section, and on pages, it's sort of in the first third of the book, where Fran is talking about giving herself permission to write, because it's so foreign to the way she was brought up, and should she really do it? And that really spoke to me. And I had the feeling that might have been a Melanie moment well.
Frances Marion, for those who don't know, was the highest paid screenwriter in Hollywood in the 20s and 30s. She was the first woman to win an Academy Award for Best Screenplay, and the first person to win 2 Academy Awards for Best Screenplay. We don't really remember her today, but she really was the top of her field, and she got there because of Mary, and writing the films for Mary that became Mary's most iconic films, like Pollyanna and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm and Poor Little Rich Girl. So I really did love writing about a writer. One thing I admired about Frances in the research was that she had a very practical side to her. She, yes, embraced her craft, her art, but she also understood at some point, what I write is no longer my own. It becomes a commodity for somebody else. That is how I've always viewed my career. I really did enjoy putting some Melanieisms in Frances. I felt really like we approached our professions in very similar ways.
Yeah, I got that too.
Yeah, I mean, she was, like me, I'm a hard worker. I will write every day. I'm not sitting around waiting for the muse to hit. I just put my butt in the chair and I write. I felt that Frances and I had a lot of similarities.
We do have a question. We have a question from Terry. What level of education did Mary Pickford actually have?
None. I mean, she was on the road from the age...
She could read and write.
Oh, yeah, yes. Certainly her mother taught her to read and write.
Right.
And she read a lot. She was always very, I think, self-conscious about the fact that she had no formal education. She never attended school. Maybe she did here and there between tours on the road, but for the most part, her mother taught her what she could. She read voraciously, I think, a lot of her adult life, particularly once she met Frances. But I think that lack of a formal education, again, she was very smart, an incredible businesswoman, negotiated all her own contracts alone, but she didn't have that formal schooling, and I do think it led to her becoming, building that little wall around her. Kind of not letting anyone in, but her family, Doug and Frances.
Right, yeah. Right. So let's talk about you for a second as a writer. You started out with two books, or it was just 2, right?
Yeah.
That had elements of mystery in them. Is there anything, and then you turned to this lush, beautifully written, I love the writing, by the way, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Was there anything that you picked up in writing the chick lit that you took with you when you started to write the more literary type books?
I do think that my best books have been, even though they're historical novels, there is an element of mystery to some of them that people seem to embrace. Whether it was Alice I Have Been, where we're trying to, what was the true nature of the relationship between the creator of Alice in Wonderland and his muse. That was kind of the driving mystery of that book. The Aviator's Wife, again, what's the true nature of this relationship? What has caused Anne Morrow Lindbergh at the end of her husband's life to say, I'm not going to be buried next to you? The Swans of Fifth Avenue, certainly there was actual someone died. So, so that was kind of the driving element. I'm not sure this book has that, other than at the beginning of the book there is a wedge between Mary and Frances. And so you wonder why, what happened. But I do think most books that are successful these days, even if they're not a mystery, you still have to have tension. You still have to have a reason to keep turning the page. Suspense. Right. People need something to keep them reading. And I would say that perhaps that's, with those first 2 books, that's where I first
Well, I have to tell you that you taught me something by reading this book, that I realized, I write mystery and crime fiction where their suspense is inbred into the story. I was riveted to the story.
Thank you.
So it made me realize that you don't need a murder mystery.
You don't need a dead body.
Or a dead body to have suspense.
Right.
And I'm sort of like,
No, I think all books have to have that in there. I really do. Even if they're classified as literary, even if they're classified as, chick lit, which isn't a thing anymore, women's fiction, whatever, there has to be that tension on every page that what's going to happen next, or I need to learn what happened. There has to be those little sprinklings
Exactly.
of clues to keep you turning that page, no matter the genre.
Between Mary and Fran, which was the easiest or hardest to write, and why?
I don't know. I think both came very natural to me. I have an acting background, a theatrical background, so that helped me with Mary. Understanding, I think, some of the vanity that is required to be an actress, and I mean that in a complimentary way, I really do. The self-preservation, the need for applause in a way. I had that side of my personality, but then Frances being more pragmatic, a writer, less of a party girl. No, Mary was not a party girl. I don't mean that, but less of a social creature than someone who's in the performing arts. I don't know. I think they both came very easily to me. I loved writing Mary's scenes. I really did. But even if they weren't, Mary was me pretending to be someone, which I quite enjoy in my writing. Frances was me kind of being me, which I've never really experienced in my books before.
So this is an interesting, you wrote Fran from first person and Mary from third.
That was my editor's suggestion.
Wow.
Originally, I wrote them both in third person.
Okay.
And she just said one day when I turned it in and I thought it was all done, she said, as editors tend to do, what if? And she said, what if you rewrite Frances's sections in first person? And to me, what that did was it made the entire book seem as if it is Frances writing Mary's story.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what Frances did in their real lives.
Right.
So I thought, oh, well, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I can't take credit for it. My editor.
Thought it was, that's a much better rationale. My thoughts were that you kept Mary at a distance with third person because you can do that, and I was trying to figure out why.
Yeah, no, it was more, to me, when my editor suggested it, for me, the reason to accept that suggestion and do it was it's like, oh, but it's like Frances is telling Mary's story, which again was what they did. That's what Frances did. She wrote Mary's movies. She wrote advice columns under Mary's names. Frances wrote Mary's story.
So I know that Fran had 2 sons, maybe?
And she did. She had 2 sons.
And Mary never had any children, did she?
So Frances, with her husband Fred, had they had a son and adopted a son. Mary did not have children with her first 2 husbands, Owen Moore and Doug Fairbanks. Tragically, Mary, and unfortunately I could not get into this in the book, because when you're writing a novel about real people, you do have to kind of trim a lot of stuff away. You can't tell everything that happened to them. I'm concentrating on the story of Mary and Frances's friendship. It means a lot of other things that happen in their lives do not get put in the book. That's why this is a novel. And Mary, in her 40s, adopted some children, a girl and a boy, with her 3rd husband, Buddy Rogers. It was really tragic for all involved. Mary, by this time, was alcoholic, a recluse. I don't know why she adopted these children. She was not ready to be a mother. She basically adopted them, I think, for photo ops, it seems to me. And then the children were handed off to nannies and put in boarding school at very early ages. And the first chance they could legally, they were out of there. So it's a very tragic situation for all involved. I would have loved to have put that in the book. It didn't fit with the narrative I was telling.
Were you at all in touch with their descendants?
No, I never do that. I've never done that with any of my books. Honestly, I respect their privacy. I would never want to borrow their stories of their parents for my personal gain in my novel. I would never want to do that. I also need room to imagine these people, as a novelist does. Sometimes if you get too close to the people who actually knew them, you have nothing left to imagine.
That's a good point. Let's talk about what happened to Hollywood in the interim. I mean, you laid out...
How did we get from there to here?
Yeah, I mean, women were, were just as important as men, or almost as important in figuring stuff out. And
inventing.
Is it because Hollywood became too obsessed with money?
Yes, that's it. That's exactly. Now, I'm not saying that Mary and Frances did not have problems with men. They did. When Mary became the first actress to have her own production company, and she was, and this is where she and Frances started making their movies together. They were first, the men, the studio heads who gave her this to make her happy, resented giving this
What was
woman.
the movie that did so well?
The Poor Little Rich Girl was
yeah,
that.
That's a great scene.
It's a wonderful scene because they made this movie. They were so pleased about it. They thought they had invented something new. They show it for the men, the studio heads, who hated it and called it putrid and did everything they could to shake their confidence in themselves and almost succeeded until the movie itself was an enormous hit. And then that's the point that Frances and Mary vowed not to let the men shake their confidence in themselves again. So there was, and the casting couch definitely was around. I think Cecil B. DeMille was probably the Harvey Weinstein of his day. That said, in those early years, before, I would say, the end of the silent era, there were still opportunities for women to direct. Universal Studios had like 30 female directors under.
You're kidding.
You know? Half the scripts made in Hollywood in those years were written by women. There were female directors. But then it became big business after World War I, when all of a sudden the international market opened up because the war had decimated the market in France and Europe for their pictures, so Hollywood stepped in. When sound came along, then you start seeing East Coast bankers investing in Hollywood. And this is when you see all these women who were there in the beginning, when they retire, they are not replaced by women. They're replaced by men. And women's stories, particularly after World War II, were simply deemed less important and less marketable than men. This is where we've been. But this is where we are now, I think, starting to say, time's up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It didn't take too long, did it? Because if you say, 1908, 1909, up through the 40s, and then, so that was only maybe 30 some years, and then after the war, we now have 60 years, 70 years since the war.
Well, here it is. I mean, here's the thing. When they're in early Hollywood, I mean, they didn't know if it was going to last. When there's not a lot of money invested, it's okay for women to take the helm, to do to be a director, to be a writer. It's okay because we don't have a lot. But once you get that big money in it, particularly, like I said, the East Coast bankers, like men like Joseph Kennedy, started investing in Hollywood, in the studios.
I guess I didn't know that.
He owned RKO at one point. This is when, it's like when the money floods in. I mean, this is not just endemic to Hollywood.
Right.
When the money flows in, when we're talking about big blockbuster films, not little ones made for $5, but you're talking about a big blockbuster superhero film today, nobody wants to trust a woman with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is just, well, we will change that. Okay, so here's the inevitable question that you probably asked again. How do you find the balance between the historical record and putting words in people's mouths and putting emotions on the page?
So what is fact and what is fiction? This was probably the number one question I am asked when I'm out there. I'm the first one to say, I am writing a novel. My primary gift is as a storyteller. I'm wanting to entertain. I am not a trained historian. I am not the authorized biographer. Please do not use my books to pass a history test. Please don't do that. I always give a list of books that are nonfiction at the end of my books if you are now inspired to go off and learn more yourself. I feel my books are kind of like gateway drugs to history. I really, really do.
I love that.
And so I am the first to tell you that. Okay. That said, the actual historical record, that's always the backbone of my book. The foundation, maybe, the bricks, the mortar.
So now, do you do a timeline?
I do often do a timeline.
Of what actually happened, and then try to figure out.
Yeah, well, what I do is I take the things that actually happened, and as I said, I'm going to leave a lot of those things out. And the ones that I think these are going to make a great novel. This is the narrative thread, and these are the things that actually happened that really enforced that narrative thread. Those are in the book as they happened. But what I am imagining in my novels are, we know Mary and Frances were best friends. We know that. But we can only speculate as to why. What were their conversations like? What were the things they shared when no one else was around that made them such good friends? That's what I am imagining. We know Mary and Douglas Fairbanks, married King and Queen of Hollywood, Brangelina of the day.
Right.
We know that. But again, what were the conversations like? What happened when the world went away and it was just the two of them at Pick Fair.
I love that, when you got underneath the superficial and we learned a little bit more about both Mary and Doug and why their relationship ultimately didn't last.
Again, a historian can only speculate. I mean, they can read letters, they can look at telegrams, but when it comes to the actual, say somebody had a fight, we know they had a fight, but what I get to do in fiction is I get to put words in their mouths. I get to describe the emotions they're feeling, what they're wearing, what they're physically doing. Those are the things we don't know. That's what a novelist does.
So all the clothes that Frances, because she was sort of a clothes horse.
She was kind of a clothes horse.
Did you make those up?
I didn't make those up. Sure, I did. And I looked at, but I looked at photographs. Again, here's what we're talking about. I looked at photographs. I saw the styles of the era. So, but yes, okay. So she shopped at Chanel after World War I. In Paris, because she was stationed there. She was one of the first female war correspondents, and was actually at the front in World War I, and she was stationed in Paris after the war. So I invented the fact she went to Chanel and bought one of Chanel's first creations.
For Fred.
For Fred.
For
her husband-to-be. Because I knew she's a clothes horse.
Yeah.
That's the fact.
Right.
That she went to Chanel. That's what I invented.
By the way, I can't read it because I forgot to bring a copy of the book with me, but there is a passage where you're describing Paris after the war that is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And you're talking about the sadness in the women's eyes and the big dark eyes and how everyone, the clothes are all dark and funereal.
Everyone was in mourning.
Yeah. And what did that come out of? Research?
It's research, but it's also me imagining being in Paris in 1918 after the armistice. Yeah. And it's me imagining myself walking down those streets. And certain things, of course, we know. Yes, we know that all the women, how many men were lost? So every woman lost a husband, a son, a brother. So that means they're in black, pretty much. We know that. But it's just those littler details. That's just me imagining.
That was wonderful.
Oh,
that was great. And we're running out of time, so I don't know if I can get into it, but I did kind of want to talk about Frances's experience in the war, and while Mary was out selling bonds or whatever she was doing. That was really the turning point of the whole book.
I think it was. It was prior to World War I. Frances, the highest paid screenwriter in Hollywood, was still primarily known as Mary Pickford's best friend and screenwriter. Then the war comes, and they have very different reactions to it. Mary doesn't, she's an actress. She doesn't really know what she can do other than make history by selling millions of dollars of Liberty bonds to fund the war. That was a very important thing she and Fairbanks and Chaplin and other actors did at the time. What she did was important. Frances decides to go to war.
Right.
And she becomes, as I said, one of the first female war correspondents, the first woman to cross into Germany as the Allies went into Germany near the end. She decided she needed to have her own adventure, I think. She was tired of creating adventures for Mary. It's time for me to have my adventure. And when she came back from war, this is the moment she decides to split with Mary professionally, that they don't work with each other again after a couple more movies, that she decides to go out on her own, and this is when she goes to MGM, where she remains for the rest of her career. And I do think the war was a pivotal point for them. And it's fascinating for me. Again, we know they did these things. What I'm exploring as a novelist is what prompted Frances to do this thing we know she did.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then we haven't even talked very much about Charlie Chaplin and how he was sort of the third leg of the
little triangle.
Yeah, the little triangle.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Mary and Charlie did not like each other.
That's what you said.
Yet, I think if you're talking about the true artists of the silent era, they're there neck and neck doing first one to have $1 million contract. Is it Charlie? Is it Mary? Depends on what source you're looking at, but they were both always there. And yet, they both loved Doug Fairbanks. Charlie was Doug's very best friend in the world. Of course, he was a great love of Mary's life. So there was always that little jealousy centering around Doug. Who's closest to Doug? And I think they're also their personalities could not have been more different. So it was kind of fun to write about Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford.
One other thing, and then we really have to go, but I can't. The morality clauses that kind of seeped in, and what I found incredible is they were mostly for women.
Well, no. They were for men too. For actors, for the performance. This happened after the Roscoe Arbuckle, Fatty Arbuckle scandal, in which he was accused of, but ultimately acquitted of, killing a young woman, raping her to death, basically, as they called it. It was this huge scandal in Hollywood. There were a couple others where people died under suspicion. So all of a sudden, Hollywood's worried about its image in the Midwest, so they hired this guy named Will Hayes to come in and clean up the town. This is when they instill morality clauses for the actors and the actresses. So there were a lot of homosexual actors in that time who their careers were very much endangered by the morality clauses too. But it wasn't, but the producers, the studio heads, the guys with the casting couches, they didn't have the morality clauses, and that's what wasn't fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this I can't believe
No, I'm so sorry.
We're way over time, but that's
Yeah.
okay because this was fascinating, and
Yes.
I knew it would be, and I knew I was going to go over, and I still haven't gotten to all the things I wanted to know.
know.
But thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure.
Sharing with us. We've been talking about The Girls in the Picture from Delacorte Press, and it is available right by just clicking one little click. If you're watching now on Facebook Live or Facebook after the fact, you can still go to authorsvoice.net and order a copy of the book, and it will be a signed copy because Melanie is going to stick around and sign some of the copies that you see in back of us. Right now, before we close, I want to just tell you about a few things that are coming up on Author's Voice over the next couple of weeks. And let's see, March 1st at 5:30 will be Ladybird and Friends with Sherry Dusky Rinker and Tiny and the Big Dig. Ladybird and Friends will return again March 6th at 1 p.m. Betsy Bird meets Kate Hannigan, author of A Lady Has the Floor, Belva Lockwood Speaks Out for Women's Rights. A House Divided, March 10th at noon. Meet Jan Jacoby, author of Young Lincoln. Stranger Than Fiction, March 15th at 3:30 p.m. Author Max Boot, ooh, I like Max. Not that I don't like everybody else, but I follow him on Twitter, okay? He's going to join us to talk about The Road Not Taken, which is his latest book. And we have a very special Solved coming up on March 16th. We're going to be featuring best-selling author Jeffrey Deaver, and we're going to talk about his whole life and his oeuvre, and we'll have The Burial Hour, which is the book right before the new book, which is coming out in April, which apparently the timing just didn't quite work for us to get the new book. So we'll be talking about The Burial Hour as well. Again, ask a question, order your signed copy at authorsvoice.net, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Libby Hellman, and have a good one.